The first thing I noticed was the smell. Hot asphalt. That thick, burnt smell that usually hangs around construction sites in the middle of summer. Except it was drifting across my property at 6 in the morning, and I hadn't scheduled any construction. I slowed my truck as I turned down the long stretch leading to my house. Normally my tires would crunch over gravel. That familiar rough sound had been part of this road my entire life. But this time, there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of tires rolling across smooth pavement. I frowned and leaned forward over the steering wheel, because the road in front of me was no longer gravel. It was freshly paved. Perfect black asphalt, stretched nearly half a mile down the hill, complete with bright yellow reflective lines and 3 brand new speed bumps. Someone had even installed those ridiculous little white signs that read, HOA Community Rad 15 miles per hour. I actually stopped the truck right there in the middle of it. For a few seconds I just stared at the road like my brain refused to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just any road. This was my road. My grandfather built it almost 40 years ago, when this entire area was nothing but farmland and trees. Long before the cookie-cutter houses, long before the neighborhood developers showed up, and definitely long before the HOA decided they owned everything within eyesight. That road alone had cost nearly $80,000 to construct and maintain over the years, and now someone had paved right over it, overnight, like they owned it. As I stepped out of the truck, the smell of fresh asphalt hit even harder, still warm from whatever crew had finished the job a few hours earlier. That's when I heard the slow clap. I turned around. Standing near the new speed bump, with a clipboard tucked under her arm, was Vivian Carter, the president of the neighborhood HOA. She had that smug, little smile she always wore whenever she thought she had finally cornered someone. "Good morning," she said sweetly. Then she handed me a piece of paper. We took the liberty of upgrading this road for the community. It was really becoming an eyesore. I glanced down at the document. An invoice. $12,437.50 for your share of the paving project, she added. I looked back up at her, then at the brand new asphalt stretching across land that legally belonged to me. And in that moment I realized something. The HOA hadn't just made a mistake. They had just paved over my $80,000 private road, and they thought I was going to pay them for it. Most people in that moment would probably start yelling. They'd argue, threaten lawsuits, maybe call the police right there in the street, but I didn't do any of that. Instead, I just stood there looking at Vivian, then at the road, then back at the invoice she'd handed me like this whole thing was some kind of neighborhood improvement project. And that's when I smiled, because Vivian Carter had just made a mistake most bullies make when they think they've already won. She never bothered to learn who she was actually dealing with. You see, before I bought this property full-time, before I retired and moved back to the land my grandfather left me, I spent 22 years in the army as a combat engineer. My job wasn't sitting behind a desk. My job was solving infrastructure problems in places where people were actively trying to kill us. Building roads, blowing up roads, securing supply routes. Studying maps, permits, property access points, legal easements, the kind of logistical nightmares that make lawyers sweat. And when you spend 2 decades doing that under pressure, you develop a certain habit. You don't react emotionally, you analyze. So while Vivian stood there expecting a fight, my brain was already doing the math. Because the truth was, this wasn't our first run-in. Not even close. For the past 3 years, Vivian had been obsessed with getting me to join the HOA. She'd mailed letters about community standards, filed complaints about my barn being the wrong shade of red, claimed my fence was non-compliant, even tried to fine me for parking my truck on my own land. But there was one small problem with her little power trips. My property existed long before the HOA did. When the developer built the neighborhood 15 years ago, the county records clearly marked my land as independent property outside the association's authority. No dues, no rules, no control, and Vivian hated that. Every time she tried pushing me around, she rammed straight into the same legal wall. So standing there that morning, watching her proudly gesture at the freshly paved road, I realized something important. This wasn't harassment anymore. This wasn't petty HOA nonsense. Vivian hadn't just crossed a line. She had bulldozed right over it. Because paving a road you don't own, charging people for it, and claiming it as HOA property, that's not a neighborhood improvement project, that's property theft. And the worst part for Vivian, she had just committed it against someone who knew exactly how infrastructure laws worked. Which meant, while she was standing there enjoying her little victory, I was already thinking 3 moves ahead. That night I couldn't sleep, not because I was angry, but because something about the whole situation felt too organized. Paving half a mile of road isn't something that just happens overnight. It takes permits, contractors, equipment, planning. Someone had arranged this days, maybe weeks in advance. And Vivian, standing there with that invoice ready the moment I arrived, told me one thing. This wasn't a spontaneous decision. This was planned. So instead of sitting around thinking about it, I went straight to the one place that never lies: county property records. If you've never dug through those documents before, it's like opening a time capsule. Every boundary line, every easement, every construction permit filed in the area gets recorded there. And about 30 minutes into searching, I found the first interesting thing: a temporary paving permit, filed 3 weeks earlier. Guess whose name was listed as the project representative? Vivian Carter. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath, because that meant she hadn't just approved paving the road. She had personally signed the paperwork, claiming the road was shared community access infrastructure, which was a lie. But that wasn't the part that really made my eyebrows go up. The permit also listed the funding source: HOA Special Infrastructure Assessment. That meant every single homeowner in the neighborhood had been charged a surprise fee to cover the paving project. Thousands of dollars each. And judging by the total cost on the permit, Vivian had collected nearly $100,000 from the neighborhood to pave a road that legally belonged to me. I'd pulled up the HOA's last community meeting notes next. Sure enough, buried halfway down the page was a motion Vivian had pushed through. During a board meeting, she'd told the residents that the gravel road was an unattractive hazard, lowering property values, and that paving it would increase home prices across the entire neighborhood. What she conveniently left out was one very important detail. The road wasn't theirs to improve, which meant something much bigger than a simple property dispute was happening here. Because if you charge 58 homeowners money for a project based on false claims, that isn't just bad leadership, that's fraud. And suddenly the situation started making a lot more sense. Vivian hadn't paved the road because she hated looking at gravel. She did it because she believed something. She believed that once the asphalt was down, once the neighborhood started using it, once the money had already been spent, wouldn't be able to do anything about it. In other words, she thought she had created a fait accompli, one of those situations where reversing the damage would be too expensive, too complicated, too messy to fight. And for most people, she probably would have been right. But Vivian had made one very dangerous assumption. She thought I was going to react like a normal homeowner. She had no idea I was already figuring out how to turn her own plan against her. You'd think after paving over someone else's road, the smart move would be to stay quiet and hope the situation cools down. Vivian did the exact opposite. Within 48 hours, she decided to push even harder. It started with the yellow notice taped to my truck windshield. At first I thought it was a parking ticket, but when I peeled it off and read it, I actually laughed out loud. Vehicle booted for parking on HOA Community Road. I looked down. Sure enough, there was a bright orange wheel boot clamped onto my front tire. My truck, on my property. on the road my grandfather built, and standing 20 feet away, leaning against her white SUV like she was supervising some kind of police operation, was Vivian. "Community rules," she said with a little shrug when she saw me staring at the boot. "If you're going to use HOA roads, you have to follow HOA regulations." For a second, I wondered if she genuinely believed what she was saying, or if she was just trying to provoke a reaction. Either way, she was making another mistake, because instead of arguing, I simply pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. The boot, the new HOA signs, the fresh asphalt crossing my property line. Vivian rolled her eyes. "You can take all the pictures you want." "Oh, I will," I said calmly. What she didn't realize was that every stunt she pulled was turning into perfect legal evidence. And she wasn't done yet. Over the next week, the harassment escalated fast. The HOA mailed me a notice claiming my barn violated community aesthetic guidelines. Someone reported my workshop to the county for illegal business activity. My mailbox got smashed one night, and a neighbor's security camera conveniently captured Vivian's nephew, driving past my driveway around the same time. Each new incident felt less like coincidence and more like intimidation. They thought if they piled on enough pressure, I'd eventually give up and join the HOA. Pay the dues, accept the road, pretend none of this ever happened. But while Vivian was busy trying to bully me into submission, I was doing something much more important. I was building a case. Every photo, every complaint letter, every report, every camera clip went into a growing folder on my desk, and then I scheduled a meeting with someone who deals with property disputes for a living, a property rights attorney. When I laid out the entire situation, the paving, the invoices, the harassment, he listened quietly for about 20 minutes. Then he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, tapping the county property map, "you understand something very important here, right?" I raised an eyebrow. He slid the map across the desk and pointed to the narrow stretch of land cutting through the neighborhood. "My road. The entire HOA depends on this road for access to the highway." I nodded slowly. He smiled wider. "And under state law." "The highway. And under state law. Since it's your private road," he tapped the paper one more time, "you can shut that access down anytime you want." When my attorney said those words, the room went quiet for a second. "You can shut that access down anytime you want." At first, I thought he meant installing a gate, or maybe putting up a few barriers. Something simple that would force the HOA to negotiate. But then he started explaining the actual law, and suddenly the situation became a lot more interesting. You see, because the road was registered as private property with no permanent easement, every vehicle using it technically relied on my permission to be there. For years I'd allowed the neighborhood to pass through, because it wasn't worth the trouble to fight about it. But legally speaking, permission can be withdrawn. And when it is withdrawn, anyone who continues using the property without authorization becomes something very specific under the law: a trespasser. Now normally that kind of situation ends with a warning sign, or maybe a lawsuit. But my attorney explained something else. Since the HOA had paved the road and declared it their own infrastructure, they had unintentionally created a very clear record of who was using it and why. Which meant if I formally revoked access, every car parked along that road would be considered illegally occupying private property. I leaned back in the chair and let that sink in. "How many homes are in that neighborhood?" my attorney asked. 58, I said. He nodded slowly. "Then, hypothetically speaking, there could be 58 violations." That's when the idea hit me. Not a small response, not a warning letter. Something that would make it absolutely impossible for Vivian, or anyone else in that HOA, to pretend they hadn't crossed the line. Because if they wanted to treat my road like community property, then they were about to learn what happens when the actual owner decides to enforce the rules. Over the next 2 days, we prepared everything. Official legal notices were drafted and sent to every homeowner in the development. The letters were simple and very clear. Due to unauthorized construction and property violations, permission to use the private roadway was terminated effective 72 hours from delivery. Times of that deadline, any vehicles parked or traveling on the road would be considered trespassing. Most people probably assumed it was just a bluff. Maybe they thought it was part of some legal argument that would drag on in court for months. But I wasn't planning a courtroom debate. I was planning logistics. So that same afternoon, I picked up the phone and called the largest towing company in the county. The dispatcher answered with the usual bored tone, "County-wide towing. How can we help you?" I paused for a second. Then I asked the question that would change that entire neighborhood's morning. Out of curiosity, I said, "How many tow trucks could you send to one location at the same time?" There was a short silence on the line. "Depends on the job," the dispatcher said. I glanced out my window toward the freshly paved road Vivian was so proud of. "Well," I replied calmly, "how many would it take to remove 58 cars?" At exactly 6:03 in the morning, the first tow truck rolled into the neighborhood. Most people were still asleep. The sky was barely turning that pale gray color that shows up right before sunrise, and the entire street was quiet except for the low rumble of diesel engines. Then the second truck arrived, and the third. Within 10 minutes, the entire entrance to the neighborhood looked like the staging area for some kind of recovery operation. Tow trucks lined the road in a slow, deliberate convoy, their amber lights flashing silently against the rows of suburban houses. The lead driver stepped out and walked over to me, holding a clipboard. "You the property owner?" he asked. I nodded and handed him the paperwork my attorney had prepared. Termination notices, property records, towing authorization forms. He skimmed through the documents, then with a slow whistle. 58 vehicles, he muttered. "That's a new one." Behind him, the rest of the tow operators were already spreading out along the street, positioning their trucks next to parked cars. Then the first hydraulic lift whined to life. That sound carried. Within seconds, a front porch light flicked on down the block. A curtain moved in someone's window. Another tow truck backed up to a driveway and lowered its hook. By the time the first SUV was halfway onto the flatbed, the neighborhood was waking up. A man in pajamas stumbled outside holding a coffee mug, staring at the truck like he couldn't process what he was seeing. "Hey, what you doing?" he shouted. The driver didn't argue. He simply pointed toward the notice taped to the windshield. "Pyruvate red, vehicle subject. To towing more doors opened. Ag. Zaggle. Subject. To towing more doors opened." More confused homeowners stepped outside, and then right on schedule, the front door of the big corner house slammed open. Vivian Carter stormed down her driveway in a pink robe and slippers, her hair half done and her phone already pressed against her ear. "What is going on here?" she yelled. She marched straight toward the nearest tow truck, just as the driver finished securing a luxury white SUV. Her SUV. For a second, she just stood there staring at it. Then she spun toward me across the road. "You can't do this," she shouted. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even move. I simply held up a copy of the termination notice her HOA had received 3 days earlier. "This is private property," I said calmly. Behind her, another tow truck lifted a sedan, then another. The street filled with the sound of engines, chains tightening, and hydraulic lifts raising car after car onto waiting flatbeds. Someone called the police. 2 patrol cars arrived about 20 minutes later. The officers walked over, reviewed the paperwork. Kay studied the property map, and then quietly handed the documents back to me. One of them turned to Vivian. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "these vehicles are parked on private property." Vivian's face went pale. Behind her, the convoy of tow trucks slowly pulled away from the neighborhood, one by one. By the time the last truck turned onto the highway, every single driveway on that street was empty. By 9 a.m., the entire neighborhood looked like something out of a disaster movie. Not because anything was broken, but because every driveway was empty, 58 homes, and not a single car in sight. The silence was almost eerie. Normally, Saturday mornings in that neighborhood sounded like garage doors opening, kids riding bikes, people leaving for errands. But that morning, the only sound was neighbors standing in the street, arguing, pacing, and staring down the freshly paved road like it had betrayed them. Meanwhile, countywide towing storage yard was having the busiest morning in its company history. One by one, residents began calling the number printed on the towing notices taped to their doors. And that's when the second shock hit them. Each vehicle required towing fees, administrative processing, and same-day storage charges before release. Average cost per car, about times $230. Some residents were furious, some were embarrassed, but most of them slowly realized something very important. They had been warned. 72 hours earlier, every homeowner had received the exact same notice, explaining that the road was private property and access was being revoked. The document even included a clear deadline and instructions on where alternative parking could be arranged. But Vivian had told everyone the notice was fake. She told them I was bluffing. She told them the HOA owned the road now. So people ignored it, and now they were paying for that decision. By noon, the first wave of residents started retrieving their vehicles from the towing yard, grumbling but quietly accepting the situation. Vivian, however, was having a much worse day, because her Escalade wasn't just any car in the neighborhood. It had been the first one to disappear, and thanks to a small legal detail involving unpaid HOA legal expenses and an ongoing property dispute, it stayed in the impound lot far longer than the others. 6 days, to be exact. 6 very public days where every neighbor drove past her empty driveway and remembered exactly how this entire situation started. Within a week, the HOA board called an emergency community meeting. For the first time in 3 years, Vivian wasn't sitting at the front of the room controlling the agenda. She sat quietly in the back, listening. Residents spoke up about the fines, the harassment, the constant threats over minor rule violations. Stories that had been whispered privately for years suddenly came pouring out in front of everyone. By the end of that meeting, the HOA board voted to dissolve Vivian's leadership position and suspend all enforcement actions until new bylaws were written. 2 weeks later, a for sale sign appeared in Vivian's yard. A month after that, she was gone. And the road? It's still there, still private, still exactly where my grandfather built it, nearly 40 years ago. But now, when the neighbors use it, they do something they never bothered doing before. They ask permission. And every Saturday morning, when I walk outside and see those 58 cars parked peacefully along the road, I can't help but smile. Because sometimes the fastest way to teach people about property rights is to make every single car on the street disappear.